So I'm going to talk about the Ukraine and some of the history that's led up to the current crisis there. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot in the media giving background that helps people understand what's happening now. First thing about the Ukraine to understand is that it's not like Britain, it's not like England. England's existed in its current borders really since the reign of King Athelstan about 1200 years ago. The Ukraine historically has been nebulous. It's moved and shifted, and it's been under different jurisdictions. It's been under Russian control, it's been under Polish, Lithuanian control, and as a sovereign entity, it's only existed since the 1920s. Not that that's any reason to destroy it now, but it should be understood that it's not a great historical nation state that can be traced back across the centuries. And I think the relevant story begins in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar, followed in October of that year by the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks were a highly centralized, highly disciplined, conspiratorial political organization and ruthless. And after their revolution, they wanted the whole of Russia to be obedient to them. But not everyone was prepared to go along with that, especially in the Ukraine, where there was a revolution led by Nestor Makhno, who was very popular amongst the peasants because he wanted the peasants to have their land. And the peasants didn't want to be under the heel of landlords anymore. They wanted to control their own destiny. But Bolshevism was all about the importance of the party and obedience to the party, and it was based on the industrial working class, not a rural peasantry. So the Bolsheviks under Trotsky tried to crush Makhno and failed. And then there was the counter-revolution, the White Revolution, those who wanted to restore the Tsar. And the Bolsheviks were threatened, and because they were threatened, they had to form an alliance with Makhno against the Whites. And between them, they defeated the Whites. The Bolsheviks once more are strongly in control, and then they turn on Makhno, and this time defeat him. And there's a huge amount of resentment and bitterness in the Ukraine, some of which manifests itself in very unpleasant ways, pogroms against the Jews, thousands of whom were killed in their villages, others starved. And in part, I think this was prompted by the fact that so many of the Bolshevik leaders, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, were Jewish. And then 10 years later, during the time of Stalin, there was forced collectivization of the Ukrainian peasants. In other words, not allowing them to own their own land, not allowing them to have self-governance, but forcing them effectively into government farms against their will. And the result of this catastrophe was a famine in the Ukraine. Robert Conquest, the historian, has estimated that between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians starved to death, which is an extraordinary thing and something very few people know about. And probably for this reason, when Nazi Germany invaded Russia in 1941, many Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis as liberators. Large numbers of Ukrainians joined the Waffen-SS, particularly towards the end of the war, and there was marked anti-Semitism within that country. We come to after the Second World War, after Nazi Germany's been defeated. Stalin is discredited, he's died, and we get Khrushchev. And Khrushchev gives the Crimea to Ukraine. The Crimea had always been Russian, it had never been Ukrainian. This was a sort of foible of Khrushchev. Some say he was drunk when he made the decision, but it certainly wasn't historic. Coming right up to date, to our own times, we see NATO moving further and further towards the Russian borders. And it needs to be understood, the paranoia of Russia about invasion, not just the Nazi invasion of 1941, you can go back to the 19th century and Napoleon's invasion, and the catastrophic consequences for the people of Russia, who lost millions of people in these wars. So the encroachment of NATO towards Russia's borders are a legitimate concern, not just for Putin, but for Russians generally. We should also remember, in regards to the present crisis, that in 2014, the pro-Russian president of the Ukraine, who might well have been corrupt, was nonetheless overthrown in a violent coup. He wasn't thrown out in an election. And on that occasion, representatives of NATO and the European Union rushed to Kiev to support this violent coup. And that also must have spooked the Russians and made them wonder exactly what NATO and the West's intentions truly were. So we now have this crisis. We now have the war in the Ukraine, the terrible war, and this can be seen as a culmination of 100 years of strife and bitterness. And surely what is required are level heads. What we need is people to get together, to sit round the negotiating table and to find a solution that guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also ensures the security of Russia. And sadly, these sort of level-headed councils do not seem to be prevailing at the present time.